Hello, thanks for tuning in for my talk. I'm Todd Borlik from Purdue University. I'll be speaking about Caliban as an ecological Indian, or how not to read the Tempest. He is uniquely at home with earth nature. However brutish he may have been, his closeness to nature demands respect. He is at one with the elements, and his contacts cover nature's springs and fertility. He is aware of spirits within animal forms. In his words, we shall find a close-up of nature. He speaks as one embedded in it. A sophisticated man cannot be. I am, of course, speaking about Caliban, or rather, I'm citing the words of the great Shakespearean G. Wilson Knight, speaking for Caliban in a badly dated and infelicitously titled essay, Caliban as a Red Man. Knight published this piece in the late 1970s, a time when the ecological Indian trickled into the public consciousness on the tears of the crying Indian in an iconic PSA against pollution, and was further broadcast by the recitation of Chief Seattle's speech at the inaugural Earth Day. While it's unlikely that Knight, who was teaching at Leeds at the time, saw that famous ad, he and the actor playing that crying Indian do have something in common. The actor known as Iron Eyes Cody, pictured here on the left, who was cast as a Native American in several Hollywood westerns and claimed to be of Cherokee and Cree ancestry, was in fact Sicilian. Now, Knight, as far as I know, never claimed to be anything other than the Oxford-educated British academic that he was, at least offstage. But in addition to being a charismatic lecturer, Knight moonlighted as a thespian and performed patriotic monologues from Shakespeare's history plays in the West End during the Blitz. And he also gave several other dramatic recitations. And in a 1977 postscript to the Caliban essay, Knight adds, I have concluded certain recent performances with a short delineation of Caliban in Red Indian guise. At a 1981 gala at his alma mater, Dulwich College, Knight astonished the audience when the 84-year-old professor stripped to deliver Caliban's speeches au naturel. Now, I have looked to try to find videos of this. I've not been able to come across a video or photo of Knight in red face. If you know where one is, maybe let me know, or maybe don't. There are some things that probably don't need to be preserved for posterity. Yet Knight's essay is a fascinating relic of an era in which it became increasingly acceptable to idealize Native American culture for its eco-spirituality. That Knight's understanding of that culture was crude and hopelessly romanticized is obvious from a cursory perusal of the sources he acknowledges and cites in this essay. These include things like Carlos Castaneda's Fraudulent, the teachings of Don Juan, Francis Parkman's 1849 historical novel, The Oregon Trail, Teresa McLuhan's countercultural manifesto, Touch the Earth, John Neihart's heavily ventriloquized The Black Elk Speaks, and what Knight calls, with no apparent hint of sarcasm, that classic document of Red Indian life and culture, Longfellow's Hiawatha. Excuse me while I gag. For all its egregious flaws, is Knight fundamentally wrong to seek for ancestors of the ecological Indian in Shakespeare's play? In his declaration that Caliban's earthiness is by Native American standards wholly honorable, might we hear a well-intentioned, if insensitive and bungled attempt to read that teaches us how not to read the Tempest from an eco-indigenous perspective. Now, a full appraisal of the ecological Indians beyond the scope of this talk, suffice it to say that even those sympathetic to it, myself included, would caution that it risks obscuring the cultural and technological achievements of Native American civilizations, reducing them to an animal-like and static existence without any history. That's a problem, right? But rather than debunk the ecological Indian, as Shepherd Krech notoriously did, or attempted to, or naively celebrate this trope, I'd like to try to contextualize it, to reconstruct what Shakespeare's contemporaries knew or thought they knew about Native American environmental beliefs and practices, with a particular focus on the Powhatan peoples of Eastern Virginia. At the same time, I will try to strive to listen to, or at least attend to, the historical silencing of Indigenous voices, as Knight's essay conspicuously fails to do. In order to recognize the ecological Indian and Shakespeare's heterogeneous Caliban as offsprings of cultural collaborations in the contact zone. With the powerful fusion of post-colonialism and eco-criticism and the growing recognition of the need to pay greater heed to Indigenous voices, the temptation to transform Caliban into an ecological Indian seems almost irresistible. Indeed, this refashioning of him is already happening. Jonathan Bate, for instance, observes that Caliban is attuned to the ecology of the island in a manner analogous to that of Indigenous peoples. Amy Tigner turns to the book Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the Earth by the Australian Appalach writer Tyson Yunkaporta to champion Caliban's perspective of the island and its resources. In a wonderful recent piece by Carolyn Sale, she looks at the dances in the Tempest alongside the Powhatan custom of dancing, seeing it as a form of kinesthetic wisdom expressive of an Indigenous intimacy with the earth. The Mohegan playwright Madeline Sayet has a similar view in her one-person play Where We Belong, which rebukes Prospero's settler colonialist ethos of dominion over nature while remaking Caliban into a spokesperson for Indigenous land rights and a worldview in which culture and ecology are entwined in the service of the health of both the land and the community. Monique Allwart's book swivels a spotlight onto Ariel as embodying the elemental fluidity of this tropical environment as experienced by the subaltern, but attributes a similar viewpoint to the rock-bound Caliban, whose curses counter the rather common colonial assumption that human beings were qualitatively distinct from a natural world they could claim and codify as property. Now, my aim is not to quarrel with these readings, much less lump them with Knight's, but to try to qualify them and historicize them by sketching in the cultural context that helped to germinate these impressions over time. Allwart's own analysis lights the way towards such an understanding and recognizing that ecological intimacy may be a consequence of conquest, dispossession, and enslavement rather than a quasi-mystical state in which all Indigenous beings lived prior to contact with Europeans. Supplementing that approach, I would argue that the vision of Virginia and pre-1607 as an Edenic golden age partly represents an inverted image of environmental degradation in England, is partly stemming from English misunderstanding and misrepresenting of Indigenous land use practices, and partly a byproduct of the environmental conditions produced by the catastrophic epidemics that the English themselves unleashed. While the ecological Indian emerges as a backlash against extractive colonialism, early English representations of the Powhatans primarily serve to encourage colonization rather than oppose it, by portraying the land as miraculously bountiful and hence underexploited, and by the same token, imagining native Indigenous knowledge of the land will open it up to European encroachment and extraction rather than shield it from them. Is that also true of Shakespeare's The Tempest? Before dismissing offhand the idea of Caliban as an ecological Indian, it's worth bearing in mind that this trope has a long pedigree stretching back well before the 1970s. Flickers of it can be seen in the writings of Charles Eastman, Ohiyesa, or Luther Standing Bear, arguably even in the sayings of the white Indian Leatherstocking in Fenmore Cooper's The Pioneers. But the trope predates Cooper and could be understood as a metamorphosis of the noble savage stereotype, progenitors of which definitely existed in Shakespeare's lifetime. We might see it, for instance, in John White's famous images of the southeastern Algonquin that appeared in Thomas Harriot's book. And of course, it's on display in a famous essay by Michel de Montaigne of the cannibals. In this locus classicus for the eco-Indian, Montaigne praises their idyllic lifestyle, saying that it belies their fearsome reputation as anthropophagi, painting their culture in broad but very flattering strokes. Now, since the 1700s, Shakespeareans have known that the playwright lifted this speech almost verbatim from John Florio's translation and plugged it into The Tempest. Although this speech prefigures key traits of the ecological Indian, it's crucial to note that Shakespeare puts it in the mouth not of the island-born Caliban, but of the Neapolitan Gonzalo. And Gonzalo here is speaking about a hypothetical plantation or European colony, right? Not about the native inhabitants of an island that at this point he believes is uninhabited. Now, for Shakespeare's contemporaries, Gonzalo's name would recall the naturalist Gonzalo de Oviedo, whose work is distinguished by its fascination with the people, the flora, and the fauna of the so-called New World, portraying it as a place of cornucopian bounty. So let's think about this. One of the speeches most responsible for seeding the idea of the ecological Indian comes from an Italian character named after a Spanish naturalist, written by an English playwright, citing a French philosopher. The speech is decidedly European slant, invites two pressing questions. First, to what extent does Gonzalo's monologue provide an accurate depiction of Caliban's life on the Isle prior to Prospero's arrival? And secondly, to what extent does Montaigne's ethnography, based on Spanish reports of the Tupinamba of Brazil, apply to the Powhatan peoples of the Tidewater, Virginia region, encountered by Shakespeare's countrymen? I'm out of time, so I'll have to leave it there, but I'm very interested to hear what you think the answers to these questions might be. Look forward to chatting with you in the Q&A, or you're welcome to email me at tborlik@purdue.edu. Thanks for listening.